I'll never forget the look on my neighbors' faces the day the fire truck screeched to a halt in front of my house. Smoke curled out of the kitchen window, alarms rang in the distance, and within seconds half the street had gathered, their whispers carrying through the air like wildfire. But nothing, not the smoke, not the flames, not even the chaos, compared to what they found inside. My son, the fire chief, smashed open the bedroom door with his crew at his side, ready to fight the blaze. Instead, what they uncovered was something far more shocking than any fire. There they were, my husband of 40 years and my own daughter-in-law, stuck, glued together in the most humiliating way imaginable. The gasps from the firefighters, the laughter breaking out from neighbors, the shame burning in my son's eyes, it was a moment that scorched deeper than any fire ever could. And I had orchestrated it all. So I'll ask you this, if you were in my shoes, if the two people you trusted most betrayed you in the most disgusting way, would you forgive them, or would you make them pay? This is my story. The story of a woman who gave her life, her love, and her loyalty to her family, only to discover that the two people she trusted most were conspiring against her. For 4 decades, I built a marriage, a home, and a business with my husband. I welcomed my son's wife into our lives, treating her as if she were my own daughter. I believed we were a strong family, not perfect, but bonded by love and trust, or so I thought. What unfolded behind my back was something darker than I could have ever imagined. Betrayal that seeped into the very foundation of my life, lies carefully woven into daily routines, smiles that hid venom, and plans that would have destroyed everything I had built with my own hands. But betrayal doesn't just wound, it awakens something inside you. A fire, a determination, a hunger for justice that no apology can ever satisfy. And in my case, that hunger led me to craft the most humiliating revenge my husband and daughter-in-law could have ever imagined. A revenge that didn't just expose them, but burned their deceit in front of the entire community. If you're listening to my voice right now, I want you to do something for me. Pause for a moment, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're hearing this story from. I want to know how far my revenge has traveled. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so you never miss the next story of betrayal, survival, and payback. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a slow, simmering journey that ends in a blaze of unforgettable humiliation. When I look back at my life before the storm, it almost feels like someone else's story. A woman who believed in loyalty, who worked tirelessly for her family, who thought love and sacrifice were enough to build a future that would last. I married young, to a man named Julian. He was tall, confident, with a smile that could disarm even the harshest critic. He made me laugh, he made me feel safe, and for decades I believed he was my partner in every sense of the word. Together, we built a life brick by brick, with more struggle than glamour, but with pride in what we had created. I was a baker. My kitchen was my kingdom. The smell of yeast, sugar, and butter filled my days, and over the years, what began as a small neighborhood bakery grew into a chain of shops that supplied hotels and restaurants across the city. I poured my soul into it, every recipe perfected, every order delivered by my own 2 hands in the early years. And through it all, I told myself Julian was my rock, my anchor. He wasn't a baker, not by any stretch, but I believed he supported me, encouraged me, and stood beside me as I worked my fingers raw to make our dream real. We had one son, Daniel. From the moment he was born, my life felt complete. Daniel was bright, determined, and grew into a man I was endlessly proud of. He became a firefighter, a protector, the kind of man who'd throw himself into danger if it meant saving someone else. He was my pride and joy, the greatest proof that my life sacrifices had meant something. And when Daniel married Allison, I opened my arms to her without hesitation. She was young, beautiful, ambitious, a little distant, yes, but I chalked it up to nerves at first. I told myself she would grow into her place in our family, and I tried to make her feel welcome in every way I knew how. I taught her family recipes. I shared secrets from the bakery. I gave her advice like a mother would give a daughter. I believed she was part of us. I believed she was loyal. Our dinners were simple but warm: rice with beans, roast chicken, fresh bread from the bakery. Holidays were noisy with laughter. Evenings were quiet with Julian snoring softly in the bedroom, Daniel working late shifts, and me kneading dough in the kitchen long after the sun went down. It wasn't set perfect, but it was ours. Still, there were cracks, hairline fractures I tried to ignore. Julian was always tired, always too busy. Our intimacy had faded into nothing, replaced with excuses about age, stress, and exhaustion. At first, I accepted it. After all, we were no longer the young lovers who once couldn't keep their hands off each other. But as the months turned to years, the distance grew heavier, a silence between us that felt louder than any argument. I told myself it was natural, that after 40 years, love simply settled into something quieter. But deep down, a part of me ached for more, ached for truth. I didn't know it then, but those quiet cracks were the fault lines of an earthquake waiting to erupt. The first time I felt something was wrong, it was so small that I almost brushed it off. Julian had come home late from another one of his business dinners. He tossed his jacket on the couch, loosened his tie like a man returning from battle, and collapsed into bed without a word. I gathered up his things, like I always did, and that's when I noticed it, a faint scent clinging to the fabric. It wasn't his usual cologne. No, this was something different, softer, sweeter, a floral perfume, delicate but sharp enough to cut through the air. It lingered even after I hung up his jacket. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it as though the truth might leap out at me, but in the end, I shook my head. Maybe he brushed against someone at the restaurant. Maybe I was imagining things. But once suspicion finds its way into your heart, it doesn't leave. A week later, I was tidying the living room after Julian had gone to bed. His phone lay unlocked on the armrest, the screen glowing in the dark. Julian hated technology. He barely knew how to send a text. So when I saw an unread email notification pop up, my chest tightened. Curiosity clawed at me, and before I could stop myself, I opened it. "You were incredible tonight, Dadar Salmalswain." Just 8 words. 8 words that sent my stomach plummeting into the floor. Who wrote it? Why that word, Dad? Why the heart? My hands trembled so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I scrolled, but there was nothing else, just a strange email address, random characters, offering no answers. I placed the phone back exactly where it was, my heart hammering like a thief caught in the act. That night, I lay awake listening to Julian's snoring, once a comfort, now a mockery. Days passed, but the clues didn't stop. One evening, while clearing his pockets for laundry, I found a crumpled receipt, a steakhouse in San Antonio. But Julian had told me he was in Dallas that night, meeting clients. The receipt showed a table for 2, a bottle of expensive wine, the same wine he once bought me for our 10th anniversary. A memory that had once warmed me now burned like acid. My chest tightened as I stared at the receipt. Why San Antonio? Who was he dining with? And why lie? Each detail was small on its own. A perfume, an email, a receipt, but together, they formed a mosaic of betrayal I could no longer ignore. I told myself I needed proof, hard evidence, something undeniable. But beneath that logic was a deeper truth. I was afraid, but what I suspected might already be real. The night I discovered the truth, I felt as though the walls of my life closed in on me. Julian had gone to bed, his snores rumbling through the silence of the house. I sat alone in the kitchen, the ticking of the old clock echoing like a countdown. I told myself I needed clarity, that I was imagining things, that I was becoming paranoid, but some voice deep inside, the intuition of a woman who has lived 40 years beside a man, told me otherwise. I slipped into the garage and opened Julian's SUV.
The air inside was stale, heavy with the faint sweetness of that same floral perfume.
My hand shook as I opened the glove compartment, expecting nothing, but what I pulled out froze me where I stood. A tube of personal lubricant, half used, the cap sticky with residue. I stared at it as though it might dissolve in my hand, my breath shallow and ragged. Julian hadn't touched me in years. His excuses, too tired, too old, too stressed, echoed in my mind, each one now exposed as a lie. My husband hadn't lost his desire. He had simply redirected it. The room tilted. I pressed my back against the car door, fighting the dizziness that threatened to drop me to the concrete floor. My marriage, my love, my sacrifices, all mocked by a cheap plastic tube. And then came the final blow. Under the back seat, I found crumpled napkins, damp with that same perfume, a scent that didn't belong to me, a scent that screamed of another woman's presence. I took photos of everything, my hands trembling so violently that half the shots were blurred, but I forced myself to keep going. I needed proof, not just for me, but for the storm I knew was coming. The next day, I reached out to an old friend, Mrs. Miller, who had once mentioned a private investigator. Hours later, I sat across from him in a quiet cafe, sliding a flash drive of my photos across the table. That night my phone buzzed. A single message appeared. He slept with her. Attached was a photo. Julian, my husband, at a candlelit table, his hand brushing the hand of the woman across from him, a woman I recognized immediately. Allison, my daughter-in-law. The world stopped. In that moment, betrayal took on a new shape. It wasn't just infidelity. It was incestuous, cruel. A violation not only of me but of our son, of our family, of everything sacred. I sank into my chair, clutching the phone so tightly it left marks on my skin. 40 years of marriage crumbled in a single image. It was no longer suspicion, no longer whispers of doubt. It was truth, ugly, undeniable, and devastating. And deep inside, something in me shifted. Love was gone, trust was dead. All that remained was rage, and the seed of revenge. Once the truth had been revealed, I could no longer unsee it. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed every thread, every detail, every weapon I could gather to arm myself for what was coming. The private investigator, Thomas, worked quickly. Each day he sent me updates, and each one was another dagger in my chest. The first photos were taken outside a restaurant. Julian and Allison, my husband and my daughter-in-law, walking hand in hand through the warm glow of street lamps. She wore a black dress that clung to her body, her lips painted red. He looked at her the way he had once looked at me, when I was a young bride, with a tenderness that now felt like a cruel performance. More photos followed. The two of them in a hotel lobby, their bodies leaning too close, their heads bent together in laughter, Julian's hand resting on her waist, as if it belonged there. Then came the video. Grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough. Julian opening the passenger door of his SUV with a flourish. Allison sliding inside with a coy smile. His lips brushed hers quickly, but there was no mistaking it. It was intimacy. It was betrayal in its purest, ugliest form. I watched that video again and again, each replay a self-inflicted wound. And then the final confirmation arrived, an audio file Thomas had recorded in the parking lot of the very hotel where they had spent the night, their voices clear as day. Allison's sick laugh was like broken glass in my ears. "Hurry up with those fake contracts," she whispered. "I want that bakery chain already. I want her gone." Julian Sepp's voice followed, deep, confident, almost smug. "Juliet, doesn't Sepp know anything? She trusts me too much. Leave it to me." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the kitchen floor. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. They weren't just betraying me with their bodies, they were plotting to steal the business I had built from flour, sweat, and sleepless nights. 40 years of labor, the bakery chain that bore my soul in every loaf of bread. They wanted to erase me, to shove me out of my own life and take everything I had fought for. I pressed my palms flat on the table, forcing myself to breathe. The hurt was unbearable, but it was no longer blinding. The shock had burned away, leaving something sharper. Clarity. Every lie, every touch, every whispered plan they thought I couldn't hear, now it was all mine. Evidence, ammunition, the fuel for a revenge so devastating they would never recover. And in that moment, my decision was made. I would not confront them. I would not scream or weep or beg for an explanation. No, I would wait. I would watch. And when the time was right, I would strike with precision. Because betrayal this deep did not deserve forgiveness. It deserved fire. For a long while after I had the recordings, I did nothing but breathe, and even that felt like an act of defiance. I moved through the days with a practiced calm, serving customers, kneading dough, counting tills, while a storm thundered behind my ribs. The bakery became both refuge and rehearsal hall. The rhythm of my hands at the mixer steadied me, and the cash register's soft clink kept me tethered to a life I refused to lose. But the truth had a gravity all its own. It pulled at everything I'd built. There were nights when I sat alone in the dark kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, my only company, replaying their voices in my mind, until they seemed to change shape and hurt even more. I thought of Daniel, my boy, and how he trusted the two people who had betrayed him. The cruelest cut wasn't the deceit between Julian and Allison, it was the way they'd weaponized my son's love, turning it into the instrument of my undoing. Grief came first, a heavy, aching thing that made simple tasks monumental. I cried silently into flour sacks, because I could not show my pain where other people would see it. Then anger followed, not the shout in the street kind, but a slow, clear flame. It wasn't theatrical, it was practical. It made me meticulous. It sharpened my vision until every lie, every omission, every casual kindness Julian had offered over the years stood exposed under cold light. That clarity was dangerous. It taught me to stop feeling like a victim and start thinking like a strategist. I imagined confronting them and watched myself crumble beneath the rawness of it. I imagined drama, shouting matches, lawyer letters that would take years. None of that appealed. What I wanted, what I needed, was a reckoning so absolute that it would close the book on their plans in one clean, unambiguous act. I wanted them to lose what they had tried to steal: my reputation, my business, my dignity, their place inside my son's life. There were moments of doubt. I wondered if revenge would hollow me out, make me into someone I didn't recognize. I asked myself if forgiveness might be the simpler path. But every memory of their whispered scheming, every line in the audio where Julian dismissed me as trusting too much hardened my resolve. Forgiveness felt like erasing my own story. Revenge, carefully measured and final, felt like reclaiming it. So I made a choice. Not a reckless, impulsive choice, but a quiet vow sealed in the bakery's warm light. I would not allow them to rewrite the narrative of my life. I would keep what I had created. I would reveal the truth on my terms, in a way that left no room for pity or excuses. And when the day came, the world would see them exactly as they were: exposed, humiliated, and comprehensively outmaneuvered. That night, as I closed the shop and flipped off the lights, I folded that decision into a plan. I would move forward with patience. I would set the stage and wait until the moment was perfect. Revenge, I reminded myself, was an art, and I intended to make it a masterpiece. Once I had every piece of evidence in my hands: photos, videos, the audio that proved their plot, the wild, hot part of anger cooled into something surgical. I stopped imagining scenes of confrontation and started thinking in terms of choreography. Revenge, I decided, would be a performance, well-timed, public, and final. It would expose them not with yelling or drama, but with a single, undeniable scene that everyone would remember. First, I protected what mattered. I copied every file twice, locked the originals in a drawer, and placed a flash drive where no casual eye would find it. I put the divorce papers I'd had typed and ready into an envelope and slid that envelope into the back of a drawer where the old family photos lived. Preparation felt like armor. If anything went wrong, I wanted my house of cards already built, so I could walk away with proof and dignity. Then I planned the stage. I couldn't risk a messy confrontation that would produce nothing but tears and legal wrangling. I wanted spectacle, something that would strip away the last shreds of their respectability and make the betrayal impossible to ignore. It had to be public enough to be witnessed, yet precise enough to avoid collateral damage to others. I thought of places, timings, the people who would notice, even the way the neighborhood liked to gather when anything unusual happened. The idea came from a small, startling fact: the lubricant in the glove compartment. On its own, it was a humiliation, a tiny plastic accusation. But in my mind, it suggested a way to create a moment that was both private and exposed, something that would leave them physically stuck together in a way the world could see and react to. I didn't dwell on mechanics or how one might carry such a plan out. What mattered was the image: two people caught and immobilized, forced into an instant of public reckoning. That image, I knew, would travel faster than any courtroom document or whispered rumor. At the same time, I arranged other pieces, like a careful gardener tending plants to bloom at the right time. I hired Thomas to keep surveillance and to be ready with new photos if the situation shifted. I made sure every recording device was charged and hidden where it would capture the truth without being noticed. I prepared the paperwork I would need afterward: evidence organized, dates noted, accounts of conversations typed up. I did not plan violence, I planned exposure. Practicalities were important, but emotion guided the design. I thought about who I wanted present the day it happened: neighbors who had always been friendly, the woman who baked with me and kept an eye on the house, the people who would understand that this was not a petty spectacle, but a final accounting. Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor and friend, was the perfect witness. She knew me, she heard everything, and she would see the truth and stand on the right side of it. I arranged my movements so that I could be the unseen hand, the quiet presence off stage, while the community observed what unfolded. I also prepared for the aftermath. I knew humiliation would ricochet, there would be gossip, there would be anger, there would be pain. I made plans to protect the bakery's reputation. Messages drafted for suppliers, a simple statement I could use if reporters sniffed around, and a backup plan to keep our customers reassured. More importantly, I planned for my son. I left room for him to react in his own time. Revenge was not about punishing him, but about clearing the rot so he could decide what to do with his own life. There were ethical questions I asked myself in the quiet hours. Was I becoming the same kind of cruelty I hated? Would the choice to humiliate them haunt me? The answer came in the small, stubborn truths. They had chosen to betray family for their gain. They had planned to take my business and betray my son's trust. My plan was not about inflicting pain for its own sake, but about making the truth visible and irreversible, a public mirror so that no one could credibly continue the lie. When the day came, every piece had a place. Evidence was ready to present. Backups were secured. My role was to watch and listen, to ensure the reveal happened on my terms, and to keep my son from being blindsided in a way that would strip him of agency. I would not act out of a momentary fury. I would execute a plan built on proof and dignity. Revenge, I reminded myself, was an act of reclamation, reclaiming what was taken, reclaiming my story, and doing so in a way that left no room for their excuses. And beneath all of it was a steady, almost reverent calm. For the first time since I found the tube in the glove compartment, I felt like I was moving with purpose. Every decision had a reason. Every step was about more than punishment. It was about justice, not the slow kind dispensed in courtrooms, but a clean, undeniable reckoning that would close one chapter and allow the next to begin. I left home that morning with the practiced calm of someone stepping out to run an errand, though my heart thrummed with a different kind of rhythm, one that hummed like a metronome, counting down to the moment everything would change. I kissed the photo of Daniel tucked in my wallet, as if it were a talisman, and walked across the street to Mrs. Peterson's house, with a basket of warm buns under my arm. The bakery was open, the ovens needed my hands, and the stage I'd set had to look, as always, like the ordinary life I'd spent 40 years building. From Mrs. Peterson's kitchen window, I had a clear view of my front door. She sat in her favorite chair with a mug of tea, and a look on her face that mixed curiosity with a kind of protective loyalty. She didn't ask any questions. She simply held the fort with me. That quiet solidarity steadied me more than I expected. The first sign that the choreography was playing out correctly was a taxi pulling up at 10 in the morning. I watched Allison step out, small and immaculate in a floral dress and dark sunglasses, the way people who expect attention always manage to look effortless. Julian opened the door with a quick, practiced flourish. The move looked rehearsed, like a man putting on a costume. He glanced around, hurried, eyes furtive, the lover's glance, the conspirator's caution. They slipped inside before the door had time to click shut. I turned the small receiver of my hidden recorder up to my ear. The little tinny voice coming through felt like a conduit from another world. Laughter, the clink of cutlery, hushed voices. I could hear Allison's high, confident chuckle, and Julian's lower, familiar hum. My hands were steady, my breathing was a long, measured thread. I sipped Mrs. Peterson's tea, as if it were part of the set. The absurd normality of it made me smile with a cold pleasure. Inside the house, they moved with the arrogant slowness of people who believed themselves invisible. They made mistakes because of that arrogance. A phone left face up on the kitchen counter, an umbrella forgotten near the door, small breadcrumbs that told a patient hunter everything she needed to know. I listened as they talked, as Allison insulted and plotted, and Julian reassured her with the same promises he'd given me for years. I let the recorder drink it all in. Then, on cue, the humiliation I had engineered unfolded. It began with the sound of a small, sudden curse, the kind of surprised cry two people make when something mechanical betrays them. I'd been watching the bedroom window through Mrs. Peterson's curtains, watching the curtains tremble as the room moved. Through the recorder I heard Allison's soft panic. "What's happening?" Her voice for the first time sounded not like a woman in control, but like a child surprised by a sudden pain. Inside my house, the glue did what it was meant to do. The tube I had slipped into the glove compartment months earlier had been used, the residue a silent witness. When they reached for it in their private, scandalous way, it did not behave like a lubricant. It hardened. It bonded. Their movements slowed, then stopped. Confusion turned to panic, and panic turned to real fear. From Mrs. Peterson's window, I watched shadows move beneath the curtains, and heard the escalating noises through my hidden device. Muffled shouting, the thud of a door, a strangled gasp. I felt my stomach twist not in guilt, but in the steady, satisfying sense of closure I'd been denied for so long. Neighbors started to look up from their own chores as smoke, from the small, controlled trap I'd wired to the stove earlier, began to curl from the kitchen vent, thin and black at first, then rolling thicker. It smelled of burnt oil. It smelled like alarm. People gathered in the street exactly as I'd pictured. Phones came out, whispers rose, and someone, the helpful kind of neighbor, called the fire department. The siren's wail cut across the morning, with the same precision I had in mind when I planned the scene. I did not move from Mrs. Peterson's chair. I watched as events spilled into the public eye. The firefighters arrived in a flurry, hoses unrolled, boots thudding on the pavement, and then, the moment I'd rehearsed in my head until it was nearly perfect, my son led the crew to the front door. Daniel's uniform fit him like armor. His face, when he pushed through the smoke and the confusion, was a map of professional focus. But when he saw the bedroom doorway, when he saw what lay beyond, something in his expression cracked in a way that made my heart wrench, even as my plan reached its apex. They found them together on the bed, Julian and Allison, immobilized not by shame alone, but by the literal adhesive that had fused them. The firefighters' reaction was a peculiar blend of disbelief and professional duty. Hands moved quickly, not to mock, but to separate, to preserve life. The initial shock on Daniel's face, the heated flash of betrayal that crossed him, transformed into a steel of command. He barked orders to his team, and then, for a brief, private second, looked at me, or perhaps he just looked into the space where I stood in Mrs. Peterson's kitchen, and the pain there was a weight I'd been carrying for months. I listened to the commotion through the recorder, the coughs of men working in smoke, the muttered disbelief as they realized the true nature of the entanglement, the indifferent clicks of cameras as neighbors recorded. There was no dignified way out for the pair now. The scene was public, shared, and indelible. When they were finally carried out on makeshift stretchers, wrapped in thin hospital sheets, faces pale and streaked, the street exploded into a chorus of reactions. I heard a woman near Mrs. Peterson exclaim on her phone, a neighbor muttering something about how filthy, another making a shaky joke to break the tension. Mrs. Peterson squeezed my hand, an anchor of steady support. In that moment my son, my boy, stood amid the crowd, uniform still dusty from smoke, his jaw tight and his body a fortress of suppressed emotion. He did not speak to me then, perhaps he didn't need to. The world had seen what I had only suspected, evidence now roared in living color before him. There's a surreal quality to orchestrating humiliation. You imagine it many times, but you cannot prepare for the actual sound of it, the live reactions, the sudden public dissection of private sin. The cameras and cell phones turned a private betrayal into a communal spectacle. My revenge had not been just for me. It had been for every morning I'd risen before dawn, and every loaf of bread that bore the imprint of my hands. It had been for the slow erosion of trust, and the quiet ways my life had been stolen. As the sirens faded, and the crowd dispersed, the echo of what happened lingered like a scent. The bruises, the physical and emotional, would take longer to heal. But in those first hours, something had shifted irreversibly. They were exposed. Their plan to take everything had been interrupted, and the community had seen the truth. The rest I knew would unfold in hospital corridors, in divorce papers, in whispered gossip, and in the hard work of rebuilding. I walked back across the street slowly. When the commotion finally settled, Daniel met my eyes then, close enough that for a second the world felt small and private again. There was pain there, yes, but also a recognition, not of my triumph, but of the fact that the rut had been revealed. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. He simply took off his helmet and sat down, as if for the first time understanding the full weight of what had been done. The execution had been raw and public, messy and precise, all at once. It was the culmination of months of evidence, of quiet preparation, and of a resolve that had hardened into action. I had not reveled in cruelty. I had crafted a reckoning, and when they were finally separated, their faces streaked and their pride in ruins, the truth was no longer mine to whisper. It belonged to the street, the hospital, and the history of our family. The days that followed were a blur of sirens that no longer signaled rescue for me, but rather announced a new, altered life. News traveled fast in a town like ours, faster than any loaf of bread fresh from my oven. Phones rang at odd hours. People I'd known for years approached me in the bakery aisle, with averted eyes and hands that trembled with sympathy. Some customers left notes of support tucked unnoticed between bills. Others watched the door a little longer before stepping inside, as if trying to measure whether the woman they'd admired was the same as the one who had staged that morning's spectacle. Julian and Allison became the subject of whispered conversations and stunned stares. Social media, always a hungry beast in a small community, ate the footage and spat it back out in new forms. Clips set to commentary, stills overlaid with shocked emojis. The humiliation I had engineered was no longer contained to our street. It rippled out into the wider world. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months sent messages of disbelief. Suppliers called, asking questions I'd already answered in my head. The bakery's phone lit up with well-wishers and a few venomous calls from advocates on the other side of the story. It was messy. It was public. It was irreversible. At the hospital, the scene unfolded the way I had imagined and feared. The staff did what they could. Medical teams separated them with tools and skill, treating burns and abrasions and the raw pain that follows a shock to the body and the soul. I slipped through the sterile corridors with the divorce papers in my pocket like armor. I watched Daniel as he moved through the clinical light of the ER, the professional composure he adopted on the job, the private collapse he allowed himself when the door closed behind him. He was a man contending with betrayal in its most intimate form, betrayed by the two people he had trusted above all. I visited once, then again. There were moments that felt like theater in reverse. I, the orchestrator, entering the stage after the curtain had fallen. Doctors and nurses were professional and discreet, but the hallway murmurs were a chorus I could not fully tune out. At one point, a nurse asked me with genuine concern if I needed anything. I only shook my head and pressed the envelope of documents harder into my palm. When the divorce papers were brought forward, the ritual of separation felt almost anticlimactic compared to the morning of public reckoning. The legal steps were necessary, of course, but everyone knew the real penalty had already been paid. Reputation in a community is a fragile currency. Theirs had been spent in a single searing morning. Where once their future had looked like quiet dinners and business meetings, it now looked like a trail of shame and the slow, grinding legal consequences that follow. Daniel's reaction was its own kind of punishment for both of them. He did not shout or make a spectacle. He moved through his grief with a solemn gravity, first by ensuring his father and wife received proper care, and then by stepping back to decide, on his own terms, what family would look like going forward. He refused to be the vehicle of my revenge. Instead, he became its witness, the human measure of the damage. There were days he avoided the bakery, and then days he returned with small acts of normalcy, a quiet conversation about inventory, a practical question about suppliers, gestures that helped rebuild the scaffolding of our life. Public reaction varied. Some people condemned what I'd done as cruel. Others hailed it as a necessary surgical exposure of deceit. There were columns of commentary online debating whether humiliation equaled justice. I read them all, though hatred and praise were equally hollow. What mattered was that the decision I'd made had closed one door and opened another. The bakery would continue because I would not let their treachery claim it. My customers, many of whom had been with me since day one, proved their loyalty in small, steady ways: extra orders, encouraging words, the honest, warm business that kept me afloat. There were losses I hadn't foreseen. Close friends took sides from which they would not return. Family gatherings thinned out. The comfortable anonymity of being a baker in a community shifted into a strange visibility. I traded some privacy for a reclaimed dignity, a bargain I accepted because dignity meant something solid and untransferable. In quiet moments, exhaustion would pin me to a chair, and I would think of the years that had led up to that morning, and the years ahead that would require rebuilding in their own slower way. And yet, even amid the rubble, there was work to be done. The bakery needed new invoices filed, the staff needed steady leadership, and my son needed room to grieve, and to decide what companionship would mean for him in the future. I set about the practicalities with the same discipline I'd always used in the kitchen, methodical, precise, and steady. The revenge had been executed. Now came the long task of repair. I consoled myself with flour-dusted hands, and the knowledge that some things, the dough I kneaded, the recipes I perfected, the relationships I'd actually nurtured, could not be stolen by whispers or stage spectacles. The aftermath was not a tidy victory lap. It was a complex, often painful recalibration of life. But the rot had been exposed, and that exposure, as brutal as it was, allowed for a future that could be rebuilt without the shadow of their secret conspiracies. The chapter had closed, violently, publicly, and though the pages were tattered, they were finally mine to rewrite. Sitting in the quiet of my kitchen weeks later, flour under my nails and the afternoon light soft on the counter, I let myself breathe in a way I hadn't allowed for months. The bakery hummed as usual. Customers came and went with their small, ordinary requests. A regular asked for his usual morning pastry. A child pointed at the display case with wide eyes, and the world kept moving, stubborn, indifferent, beautiful. It struck me then that life doesn't pause for our crises. It goes on, and within that motion we find a way forward. I lost a husband that morning. I lost the fantasy of a family that would survive anything. I lost the illusion that trust was a given. But I kept other things. My name, the bread I made, the son who chose in his own time to be with me. Those are not small consolations. They are the bones of a life rebuilt with honesty. People ask me, sometimes with incredulity, and sometimes with admiration, whether I regret what I did. The short answer is complicated. There are nights when the memory of their faces, pale, humiliated, stunned, wakes me, and there's a hollow ache that no victory can fill. There are mornings I wake up with a pinch of shame for having engineered such widespread humiliation. I won't pretend I was above the moral dilemmas. I am not a saint. I am a woman who was betrayed and who chose to act. But if you ask me whether I would allow them to quietly take everything I built and keep my mouth shut while they rewrote my life, no, I would not. The revenge I chose was not born of a thirst for cruelty, but of a need to reclaim truth and to protect what remained. It was a way to make the betrayal visible and irreversible so that the lies could no longer hide under polite smiles and staged normalcy. So I ask you again, now that you've heard the whole story, was my revenge too far, or was it justice served? Tell me what you think in the comments, and where you're listening from. Share your own stories, your own crossroads, your own moments when you had to choose between silence and action. If you found this story gripping, subscribe for more revenge tales, stories of betrayal, survival, and the sometimes messy justice that follows. I'll post more soon, and I'd love to know what kind of stories you want next. Betrayals of love, betrayals of friendship, betrayals of business. Which do you find the most compelling? Thank you for listening. Keep your eyes open, trust your instincts, and remember, sometimes, the quietest person can carry the most decisive plan. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you in the next story.